Hello students, we shall continue now with another part related to anatomical evidences is adaptive radiation. Generally, when we look at the due course of evolution, we find the change in the character due to adaptations. We call them as adaptive traits or adaptive characters. These adaptive characters are due to the encountering of the organisms into different environments. So, the common ancestors that were existing years back, millions of years back, they tend to occupy different environments and started showing the adaptive changes there. Adaptive changes that brings in mutational changes in them at their genic level, that is in their DNA, and accumulation of these changes later getting inherited into their offsprings, and they continued the characters later on, leading to reproductive isolation, forming a new species of organism, which is also called as speciation. So common ancestor, when they tend to enter into different environments in all possible directions, then there the organism started to adapt and forming new characters in them, leading to different species. When we look at the left diagram at the top in this slide, common ancestor of mammal, when it has encountered the air as a medium, then it started developing the wings. So it formed aerial mode of life. Some ancestral organisms started moving to the trees and lived there, forming the arboreal life. Some ancestral organisms moved into the water, started living there by adapting themselves, forming the aquatic mode. Some started digging the soil, started entering into that burrows, leading burrowing mode of life or fossorial life. Some started fastly running on the land, grazing on the grass. Like this, when we look at same common ancestor, when had entered into different environments, they started developing a different mode of life. It is due to adaptive changes in them. So in all possible direction it moves to show these changes. So it's called as adaptive radiation. We have one more example, the final example, the Darwin's finches of Galapagos Island. The South America had an ancestral form of this finch which was a seed eater. When this started to migrate in the nearby islands of Galapagos, there they encountered different feeding habits due to competition. Some started to feed on the leaves, some started to feed on the insects, some started to feed on the fruits, some started to feed on the cactus, etc. Accordingly, they started modifying their beak. So based on their feeding mode, the beak modification was seen in these finches. A very good example of adaptive radiation. So what the common concept of adaptive radiation? When an organism enters into a newer environment, in all possible directions they form a newer species. So a major group of ancestors will form species, subspecies, etc. And this is due to adaptive characters. The natural selection is by adaptive characters in them. A very good example related to adaptive radiations are these two. Now we shall go in detail related to the concept of adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation can be defined as the evolution of different species of organisms in different geographical environments showing the mutational changes or genetic changes which gets accumulative and inheritable, leading to formation of newer species. In simple terms, adaptation of an organism that brings in the formation of newer species. So this is a good example of the concept of anatomical evidence of organic evolution. Students, remember, when a single organism enters into different environments to form different species of organism due to adaptation, we call it as adaptive radiation or macroevolution or divergent evolution. When we look at the concept of theory of evolution given by Darwin, he says whenever an organism enters into a newer environment, it shows changes with reference to the physical as well as anatomical, meant to say external and internal change of structures. It is mainly due to change in the environment influence. So, when an organism encounters a newer environment, there is change in their physical appearance and anatomical structures, which we call it as adaptation. And these characters, if it is selected by nature in the due course of evolution, then from a common ancestor there is splitting of different species. So formation of different species, which we call it as adaptive radiation. Students, remember, like how a sun radiates in all possible direction, in the same way a common ancestor will radiate into different environment forming different species ultimately. This is what Darwin has seen in the finch varieties, that is seed eating variety at Galapagos Island. The concept of adaptive radiation, it just relates to change in the characters in them, right? These change in the characters, both physically and anatomically, are under the control of genes, remember this. Because every character of an individual is controlled by a gene. So genes will influence the change in the characters of organisms. So those changes are collectively called as adaptive trends. And the process of formation of these changes in the organisms due to evolution, the force or environmental encountering is called as adaptive radiation or macroevolution. As we discussed, the popular example related to adaptive radiation is the finches of different type having beaks in them, identified by or observed by Charles Darwin at Galapagos Island. So down is a picture that represents from a seed eater ancestors, different forms of finches were originated, it's merely due to the concept of geographical or environmental influence in the character change, that is variation in the feeding habit. The other example related to adaptive radiation is Australian marsupial of different types originating from a single ancestral stock. Students, marsupials are mammals which diverge into different orders and species from a common ancestral variety called as order Australidelphia. So from a common group of ancestors, different Australian marsupials have originated. A very good example related to adaptive radiation. We are going to discuss that in detail when we go with the types of macroevolution or adaptive radiation. Coming on to the concept of mechanism of macroevolution, that is, how does macroevolution process takes place in the nature. It starts with the level of species, an individual organism. Then it gets into a different individuals, a group, species, then generic, then comes families, then comes orders, then comes classes, then comes phyla. So like this, stepwise, there is change of characters encountered by the organisms at different environments. Number one is it occurs at the individual level or at the species level. Then slowly it moves from one level to the other level of hierarchy. The second important thing is these changes are due to sudden change in the gene sequence, we call it as mutations. When an organism enters into a newer environment, they tend to show sudden mutation. So this sudden mutations doesn't happen in one or two genes. It happens with many number of genes. So the length of DNA, when we look at a maximum part of the DNA of a gene or of many genes, they show the change. So when mutation occurs at a large size, we call it as macromutations or systematic mutations. Students, remember, the macroevolution to happen in an environment, they requires macromutations or systematic mutations. And this concept was given by Goldsmith. And here is the picture related to him and the concept of mutational change, how it brings in the newer characters in the group of individuals is represented. So first thing is, it occurs at individual level or at species level, then it moves from one hierarchy to the other. Second is, it has to happen with the large quantity of DNA or many number of genes need to be involved. Third is, after they getting the characters of mutations in them, the characters need to be accumulated in them and should be passed on to their offsprings. Mean to say, the characters should be inheritable. So whatever the characters that are adaptive, generally called as the adaptive characters, they need to be inherited to the offsprings. Only then there forms splitting of a new population into subgroups. So subpopulation. So this splitting of newer groups forms the reproductive isolation in them, forming different types of species, which we call it as speciation concept. So after these adaptive changes enters into the subpopulation, they need to that character need to be again brought into the changes, again need to undergo mutation. So this is what we call as cumulative effect. Students, remember, the environment need to show a constant pressure on the organism to become that organism fittest or adjustable to that environment accepted by the nature, which we call as natural selection. So cumulative effect plays a very important role, and this cumulative effect should pass in the directions. So it could be a single direction or towards all the possible directions. So that's about the importance of mechanism of macroevolution. I repeat, macroevolution concept first starts with the individual or with a group of members. Number two, there should be mutational changes happening in a large quantity of genes or DNA. Third, it should be inherited. Fourth, it should get accumulated, because continuously the character need to be modified. Next, after we understanding the concept of adaptive radiation and the mechanism, the next is types of adaptive radiations. Students, remember, there are two major types of adaptive radiation. First type is adaptive divergence, the second is adaptive convergence. When you look at the diagrams down towards the left side, from one common ancestor there occurs different species of organisms. So this kind of species formation from a common ancestor, when they encounter different environment, we call it as adaptive divergence. Reason is that common ancestral form will give rise to many new subspecies, which we call it as divergent evolution or adaptive divergence. Whereas the second example towards the right side, when we look at, there is an example of fish, an example of mammal, example of reptile, example of a bird. All these organisms, when they enter into a common environment of aquatic medium or the water, when a fish entered into water medium, when a dolphin entered into a water medium, when a reptile of Ichthyosaurus enters into a water medium, or when a bird like a penguin enters into a water medium, the body shape of them tends to remain as streamlined body. You know why? It is to easily move in the water. So streamlined body is brought about in all these organisms because they entered into a common environment. When different species of organisms enters into a common environment, they tend to show a change in the character pertaining to one. So it is a unidirectional movement. So this is called as adaptive convergent or convergent evolution. Hope the concept is clear. Students, remember, in adaptive convergence, there is no concept of ancestors, common ancestors. So no diversification of new species. But in adaptive divergence, common ancestors are seen and formation of different species are also seen. So example related to adaptive divergence is finches of Galapagos Islands described by Darwin. Here, the ancestral form of species is the founder species, which is a seed eater. This variety, when entered into different feeding habitats, environments, they started to develop different kinds of beaks. So morphological and genetical changes brought in the organisms due to different environments. Example is finches, an example of adaptive divergence. What happens here is the seed eaters, which were commonly restricted to the mainland of South America, moved into the nearby islands of Galapagos, encountered different feeding habitats, started modifying their beak, but they developed from a common ancestor of seed eaters. In adaptive convergence, as we have understood, there are unrelated groups of organisms when they occupy one common habitat or an environment. Then they exhibit some common features among them, which we call it as adaptive convergence. See, it's a fish belonging to Piscean class, mammalian class is dolphin, reptilian class is ichthyosaurus, avian class is the bird. When all of them entered into a common habitat of the water, the body shape of them became streamlined. An example of adaptive convergence. One character gets changed in them. So we have other example related to adaptive divergence is Australian marsupials. Students remember, Australian marsupials includes the examples of kangaroo, marsupial rat, banded anteater, tiger cat, Tasmanian wolf, koala, all this. They are all said to be pouched mammals, especially the females will carry the young ones in their pouches for a few days of time during their development. So down when you look at the picture towards the left side, central concentrated ancestral is a common ancestral form from which diversified environment the organism enters to form different, all are marsupials, but are of different species according to the environment where they had been. We call it as divergent evolution. So when we trace out the evolution of these marsupials, it is seen that the ancient landmass of Laurasia and Gondwana, they broke apart from separate continents, and the organisms of marsupials which were there initially got divided into two groups. Okay, this is the second example that we are following. So one is a new land, it is island it formed, it was Australia, whereas the original mainland was the South America. The marsupials which got divided onto these two lands, one in Australia, the other one in South America, when we look at. Marsupials on both these continents, they entered into different environments. In parallel condition, they started showing the evolutionary changes. Parallelly, both showed equal changes, which we call it as parallel evolution. The scientists have found that the characters almost were similar between the marsupials of Australia as well as South America. So South American marsupials are called as placental mammals. Okay, the same of Australia when we look at, there was difference with slight characters, otherwise it remains same. For example, here when we look at the mouse become marsupial mouse, then anteater became numbat. Similarly, when we look at the lemurs became spotted cuscus. Then wolf became Tasmanian wolf. Remember students, the first row of names are the common names. The special names are given for the Australian marsupials because they show quite different characters in them. But maximum features were same with slight modification in them. What's happening here? Comparing the marsupials of Australia and South America, they were showing similar adaptive radiations between them. And here both showing the characters almost similar, which we call it as parallel evolution. Even though there is separate lineage, lineage refers to formation of the new organisms. They resemble each other physically almost. If you take a close look up at these organisms in the chart down, it remains almost the same. So it forms different kinds of characters which are slightly modified, but maximum will show similarity in them. So this is also an example of adaptive radiation. Students, remembered, whenever an organism encounters a newer environment, mutational change in the character, if it happens, and if that character is accepted by the nature, then that becomes an adaptive character in them. Such adaptive characters and related genes will be transmitted from parents to the offsprings to form a newer species. So this is what is the importance of adaptive radiation. So with this we are completing the concept of adaptive radiation also. So we have learnt about the concept of atavism, we have learnt the concept of adaptive radiation. Both are the best examples relates to the anatomical evidences of organic evolution. Well, students, after we understanding the concept of atavism and adaptive radiation, let us answer the MCQs now. Question 1. A baby born with a small tail is an example of what? We know that it is atavism because sudden reappearance of ancestral characters in the newborn is called as atavism. Answer is A. Question 2. The process by which organisms with different evolutionary history evolve similar phenotypic adaptations. Different evolutionary histories the organisms have, but they have evolved with similar phenotypic adaptations, like fish and then mammal of dolphin, then ichthyosaurus of reptile. When they all enter into a common environment of water, what happens? Respond to a common environmental challenge is called, it is convergent evolution. So answer should be B, yes. The study of Galapagos finches show which character here? Adaptive convergence, use and disuse organs, convergent evolution, adaptive divergence. What concept does it explain? So it explains about adaptive divergence. The example of Galapagos finches are adaptive divergence. It's not convergent. It is not convergent evolution. It is not use and disuse organs. It is adaptive divergence. Which food habit the Darwin's finches lead to the development of many other varieties? Which was the first ancestral form? It was seed eater. So answer is C. Question 5. Species which have diverged after the origin from a common ancestor, giving rise to new species, adopted to new habitats, and the ways of life is called as, what do you call if a new species are formed from the common ancestors at new habitats? What do you call this? It is adaptive radiation. Answer is A. So definition actually of adaptive radiation it is. Dash marsupials were taken as the examples of adaptive radiation. It is Australian marsupials. Answer is B. In the examples what we have quoted there, lemur is a placental mammal that resembles dash of Australian marsupials. So when you look at the picture, Lemur relates to which organism of Australian marsupial? It is spotted cuscus. Okay, the climber. Example is C, spotted cuscus. Sudden appearance of certain characters which may be related to their ancestor is atavism, also called as reversion. So answer should be both A and B. So D is the answer there. Dr. Cesare Lombroso is known as the father of modern criminology. So answer is B. The last question. Atavism is favored by which law here? Law of parallelism, no, it is adaptive radiation. Cope's rule says increase in the size of the body of organism. Then reversibility of Dollo's law. Yes, Dollo's law says that there is irreversibility of ancestral characters in the generation. But if you could reverse it, the law of Dollo, we tend to find atavism, not Hardy-Weinberg law. So answer is C. So well, students, we have learnt here after the session the role of atavism and adaptive radiations as anatomical evidences of organic evolution. The references includes the web references of Wikipedia and Britannica.com. Book references includes Organic Evolution by Veerabala Rastogi, then Evolutionary Biology by Veerabala Rastogi, then Cell Biology, Genetics, Molecular Biology, Evolution and Ecology by Verma and Agarwal. Students, please understand these two concepts, important for short notes generally. Your queries and comments can be posted to my personal WhatsApp number. Kindly go through the video. The students who haven't subscribed my channel, please do subscribe. Share this link with your other friends of other college also. Thank you all students. Take care of your good health during this pandemic time.